Good day. My name is Shane Coughlin, and I am the General Manager of the OpenChain project. The OpenChain project is one of the many projects in the Linux Foundation, and we are focused entirely on open source license compliance. OpenChain, as of today, is an ISO standard. It is the sole and solely necessary standard for process management around open source license compliance. You can find us under ISO IEC 5230. And of course, you can find us at our project website, www.openchainproject.org. Given that today is such an important day, with the release of our ISO version of the specification, I thought it might be useful and informative to talk about how we got here, and then we can talk about where we're going next. First and foremost, the OpenChain project was created to help the supply chain. We have had long-standing issues with open source license compliance in the supply chain. This is largely due to the complexity of the supply chain, the speed of product to market, and the challenge of making sure that multiple parties have adequate training and processes in place. Now, naturally, having a supply chain with issues is a challenge that we need to solve. It always has been. There was never a time when companies felt addressing the supply chain was not important. However, we lacked a single common approach to addressing the supply chain. On many occasions, individual companies would have agreements with their suppliers, usually in contracts, regarding the approach to open source license compliance they expected. These agreements would often be effective to a certain degree, but fundamentally fail to address the issue that any supplier providing products and services to many customers will have a limit on the amount of bespoke processes they can address. Furthermore, the type of request or ask you might have of a tier 1 supplier might be very different if you look at a tier 5 supplier. And juggling all of that can be quite a challenge. It has been a challenge for decades. In 2015, a bunch of the companies involved in the supply chain got together and suggested that perhaps we can pool our efforts. Perhaps we can have one single approach to open source license compliance in the supply chain. And by having this single unified approach, it will be far easier for companies around the world to actually adhere to the requirements. So that's how we started. And by October 2016, the OpenChain project was ready to go to market, and we released the first version of our standard, the OpenChain specification. Now, it's worth asking, how do you make a specification for open source license compliance that can be used across the entire supply chain, used by companies of very different sizes and companies addressing different market spaces, from automotive to consumer electronics, aviation to embedded? The answer, well, it's basically about elegance. We could try to make incredibly complex, detailed checklists that would cover all possible contingencies. And those checklists would no doubt be comprehensive and, if fully applied, successful. But in reality, having such checklists deployed, especially further down the supply chain, the chances are remote to non-existent. So when it came to making the OpenChain standard, we decided to focus on the fundamentals. It is known through experience over many years by many companies, the process points where compliance failings happen. When you're ingesting software, there are certain things that you really need to check. For example, what is the software? What's my record of that software? Do people know about how we check and record this information? These process points fundamentally are what companies need to do something at that point. And by identifying the process points, instead of telling people what to put in the processes, but identifying where there should be a process, we created a specification that incredibly, and this is with specification formatting, so there's lots of white space, incredibly is only 7 pages long. It identifies process inflection points at the inbound, internal, and outbound aspects of software management. It asks that a company has an open source policy. It asks that a company has open source training for appropriate personnel. But it doesn't prescribe what the policy should be or what the training should be. That is to the discretion of the companies at play, intentionally so, to allow the maximum number of stakeholders to adopt the process standard. OpenChain was immediately successful. Within 6 months, we iterated again, not a drastic change to the standard, but taking some feedback. For example, companies outside of the domain of software frequently wanted to train people who were not software people, but rather people managing the process. We adjusted the language from software to appropriate people. We finessed based on feedback from international participants. And this update to the standard, it was released in April 2017, met further success. And that led to yet another update in early 2018, taking into account several years of feedback, again, not changing the standard dramatically, mostly dealing with language clarification. So we had ended up with a process standard identifying inflection points that was successfully going around the world, being used by companies of multiple sizes and in multiple markets. It was the correct solution for the supply chain because of real-world use. So around April 2019, we did one more iteration of the standard, focusing very extensively on non-native English speakers meeting the standard in English and being able to understand it as clearly as possible. A lot of this was about ambiguity or assumptions on the readers. Again, we didn't fundamentally change anything on the standard per se. We just improved the clarity. And that version of the standard, April 2019, was done. For the year after that, the standard just continued to grow and grow. We had local work groups in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, then India, then Germany. And we had significant momentum in areas like North America. So at the beginning of this year, we decided to take this standard, which had evolved over many years and had been stable for a considerable period, and take it from a de facto industry standard into a formal international standard in ISO. Now, there is a process to do this. It's called a pass transposition process, publicly available specification transposition process, where a pre-existing standard can be converted into an ISO standard. And that's pretty quick because it doesn't require editing. The standard is done, and it's really a matter of adopting it as an ISO publication. It takes around 9 months. And that's what we did. We submitted to ISO in April, and we graduated today. This ISO standard is a process standard for open source license compliance that is battle tested. Our community is hundreds of companies at this stage. And now that we're an ISO standard, we're going to scale into many thousands of companies. And what does this mean? It's important for many reasons. The first, the largest, is that open source license compliance from the perspective of process management is not ambiguous anymore. Open open source license compliance is literally an ISO standard. This isn't about license interpretation. This isn't about decisions of whether you contribute to upstream or not. This is about the process management, and that process management is fixed. If you have processes in place that meet these requirements, and indeed if those processes are appropriate for your company size and your company space, then you will dramatically reduce any chance of error. We know this not because of speculation, but because this was built by user companies, used by user companies, and is continuing to be adopted by user companies. It solves our problem. Having license compliance in a process sense solved is an enormous step for business management and open source software. If anything, license compliance was the greatest consistent concern regarding intellectual property and open source. How do we manage this stuff? Well, you use the ISO standard. It's a wonderful solution to have in market, and it is one that we believe will not only reduce errors, but it will also reduce resource costs, and it will increase confidence in open source. Hopefully, meaning that we'll welcome many more companies to our community as they gain increased confidence in both the maturity and the management of this type of code. And we're seeing that in action. The open chain community has had some fascinating companies turn up that are completely unexpected. Companies in areas like consumables, for instance, Philip Morris International in Switzerland, the company behind the IQOS electric cigarette. They are active in the open chain community. We have defense companies. We have companies that are in completely left field areas that you wouldn't expect to see at the table. And of course, we have companies that you would expect to see. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, Toyota. Speaking of which, the first company to formally announce conformance to the ISO standard, again today, was Toyota. And they were followed very closely after by NCSoft, one of the very influential Korean online gaming companies. And we have some more announcements coming. In fact, tomorrow, we're announcing that Cisco adopts the ISO standard. This remarkable momentum puts us in a very unique position. This project is, as I mentioned, user companies for user companies. And it has been operating with a very, very active, very vibrant international community. What we bring to the table is far more than a standard, far more than a specification. As we did this, and remember, we're not prescriptive about how to fill out a process, but we do give people ideas. So as we did this, people asked for ideas on how do you do training? How can you do policies? What type of checklists and flowcharts can you have? How do you educate suppliers? And our global community of user companies built that material. Companies like ARM and Qualcomm, Samsung and Philips collaborated to make initial reference training slide decks, which then over 100 companies contributed to, and it's available under public domain on our website. Same story with our policy template. Many companies have contributed to that, and it's essentially playing Lego pieces so you can choose a policy appropriate to your company type and size. We have had incredible energy and success from Japan, where they made a supplier education leaflet, which is now available in Japanese, English, Chinese traditional, Chinese simplified, and Vietnamese. And we have so much more. There's actually a repository on GitHub with all of our documentation, and it's around 1,000 documents now. Some of it is pure community stuff. Some of it is official open chain reference documentation. All of it is optional. All of it is educational. Adjacent to this, if you've had some time in standards, you know that reading standards is not the most fun way to adopt them. And to reduce ambiguity, to reduce complexity, we created a conformance questionnaire. So we turned the specification requirements, the standard requirements, into a series of yes-no questions. And we put this on our site for free as a web app and of course as a downloadable document. We did so much more. We have bi-weekly webinars. This year we did 15 webinars. We have mailing lists, global mailing lists, our general list, which has got 3,700 subscribers. We've got automotive, tooling, education, global lists. We have those regional groups I mentioned, like China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, Germany, UK. They all have their own lists. And we have some great bi-weekly global calls where everyone drops in and can raise general topics. The size of the community, the activity of the community is remarkable. The goal is simple. It's to help as many people as possible adopt this standard, and on their journey to adoption, to make great choices regarding the processes that they will use. And we do everything possible to facilitate that. This project is part of Linux Foundation. It is funded by its platinum members. That's 20 companies announced, and we're announcing another company tomorrow. Top secret, it's Ericsson. I let the secret out. We have our board members funding the project. It's not an expensive project, but it is funded. And this means that absolutely everything the project produces, whether it's by using our capital or using our community, is available. It's user companies making stuff for user companies. And like I said, basically we put everything under public domain. The only stuff not under public domain is our web app, that's under Apache license, our specification, which is of course not editable, and our case studies, which again, given that they're talking about companies like ARM and Toyota, you can't edit those. But yeah, we've had a remarkable run. We've had incredible traction. And I think particularly for this audience, when we talk about automation, when we talk about companies deploying into pretty critical areas, whether it's automation in a factory environment, automation in another environment, these are not products that we want to take risks with, whether it's a legal risk or an engineering risk. OpenChain is perfectly positioned to help out. It is not a heavy standard. I mentioned earlier that it's 7 pages long. It's about 40 yes/no questions. And these questions, quite frankly, most companies already have processes in place. The main purpose of the standard is to highlight where there might be a gap or the potential for improvement. And like I said, you can get a huge amount of inspiration on the website and by participating. It's your peers working alongside you for the same reasons. Certainly any company in Germany that joins in on the automation side will find friends among the Japanese conglomerates, which are, of course, equally involved in such a field. I do hope that I can just take a moment to talk about what's coming next. And I think this is important. First and foremost, what OpenChain as an ISO standard and as a project and as a community means is that open source compliance, the uncertainty is being dramatically reduced. Open source compliance as a process is solved. There's no more ambiguity. And as an ISO number, it is now positioned intentionally for procurement cycles. We want to see open source compliance engage fully, to become fully part of sales and procurement without bespoke language. As one person quipped, they want to use our ISO standard to reduce their purchasing contracts to suppliers from 12 pages to saying, use ISO 5230. And that is basically where we're going. What you can expect next year, if you have purchasing customers, is that over time, more of them will be talking about and then preferring and then requiring that people use the OpenChain ISO standard. For supplier companies, this is also, of course, an advantage. Because OpenChain is not arduous, but it is effective, it is worthwhile for adoption. And it is a selling point for a company to say, yes, we're managing open source intellectual property according to the ISO standard for it. We expect not only that from customer level, they'll be able to require it from suppliers. From supplier level, they can use it to sell their competence. We also expect that this standard will dramatically reduce friction in the market. Instead of having to negotiate all the way through the supply chain and fight with each other on every detail, instead of having bespoke language that you have to prepare or bespoke language that you get and have to waste a lot of time on, we simply coalesce around this ISO standard. This is actively happening. As you can tell, when a company like Toyota announces ISO conformance on the day of the ISO publication, they're not kidding around for the automotive supply chain. And you may recall that I said OpenChain was finished in April 2019. And then April this year, we submitted it to ISO. So what we had in April 2019 was OpenChain 2.0. And we had to make some editing changes, not to the content, but the ISO format was slightly different. And we call that editing change OpenChain 2.1. And that's now published as ISO 5230. But actually OpenChain 2, OpenChain 2.1 and ISO 5230 are functionally identical. If you conform to one, you conform to all of them. So while Toyota is the first company to formally announce that they've adopted the ISO standard, we actually have a corpus of companies already using OpenChain 2 or 2.1. And some of these companies will be taking a stance and formally announcing that they're using the ISO standard. Some of these companies will not. You will see the listing of these companies on our website if they choose to tell us that they're using the standard. I say that because you don't actually have to tell the OpenChain project if you're using the OpenChain standard. People can self-certify. They can get independent assessment. They can get full third-party certification. And they can do it at their own discretion. Some companies are only talking inside their supply chain. They have no particular interest in being listed on our website, and that's fine. But those companies that do want to be listed on our website, you can see them today as a general category. And later this week, you'll see the ones that are conforming to ISO or equivalent, and then the ones earlier in the OpenChain lifecycle. So yeah, we're entering the year with actually a lot of companies functionally ISO conformant. A bunch of companies announcing ISO conformance this week and throughout January. And the expectation that you will find in contracts ISO 5230 increasingly, and that you can and should use 5230 in your contracts, because this is the standard that so many companies have worked on and used and had success with. It's just like open source software. So many people have put so many hours into this. It is the best way to do it in the world. And we think next year will essentially be taking our knowledge and going to thousands of companies to help them adopt the standard with as little friction as possible. We think that next year we'll see us working increasingly with governments. We're already working with the governments in the US and China and Japan. We're working with the standardization organizations in Germany and in the UK, and we'll be expanding that reach. And the project has a gravity, and increasingly it's becoming the center of how we address open source compliance. The standard is the lighthouse, and all around it, the reference materials, the work groups, the additional things like certification questionnaires, even the partner program, where we've brought all types of service providers together that can optionally help companies if the companies want it. All of that gives us the position to conclusively guide compliance from one place, run by user companies for the benefit of user companies. And that is far from concerning. That is a wonderful outcome. We all know how important open source is. We all want to get it right. We're all cognizant of so many facts that over 80% of open source code in major projects is owned by our peers, our corporate peers. The myth of the lone hacker is pretty much a myth. The majority of code is corporate code. And we all want to respect that, just as we want to respect the lone hackers that are there and their licenses. We want to have a stable, calm, predictable ecosystem, and that's what we're doing. I hope that if you're not already part of our community, you will take time in 2021 to engage. We want to hear from you. We want to learn more in the automation sphere. We want to support your work. And as we become increasingly a center of gravity for addressing open source compliance and then supporting other activities in governance, we want to try to make a world where no company ever feels lost, alone, or isolated when they're trying to deal with open source compliance. This project can guide people. It has the standard, it has the reference material, it has your peers. And that's what you'll increasingly see next year. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's not my habit to talk for a great length of time, but I did want to give you a picture of where we're going. And to end, I'd like to tell you where we will end. Not next year, but sometime relatively soon. Open source compliance, open source management will no longer be open source management. It will just be part of software asset management. Our job is to bridge us from the days where we were just beginning to coalesce into the days where we have the ISO standard today. And now, as we scale, to get to the point where open source is just software and people no longer have any perception that they're dealing with something risky, dangerous, unpredictable, but rather they're dealing in their software asset management with the most flexible, effective approach to developing software we have ever seen. We will, in our voyage, dramatically increase efficiency, dramatically reduce hours wasted on things like remediation. And in doing so, we can actually put those resources to making even better products and even better relationships in our supply chain, and then we all get to benefit. Join us, be part of it, openchainproject.org. No doubt our friends at OSADL will be able to guide you to our site and all of our material. Not least because today, OSADL has been announced as the latest partner in the OpenChain project. So they're joining all types of different service providers like PwC or TÜV SÜD in being organizations that can help you with your OpenChain journey. And I'm very glad. OSADL is an organization I've worked with for many years. Carsten and his team have a sincerity and an understanding of the field that I believe is remarkable. And as we are a bridge from the earlier uncertainties of open source through to perfect integration and software asset management, OSADL is a bridge from where we are today into the automation industry and helping us to work together faster. And it's going to be so much to our benefit. Thank you for your time.